Once again this morning I was teaching a group of Hindu background believers in Bangladesh. A small group gathers there late in the evening so I can teach them early in my morning. They've been wanting to study the Gospel of Matthew, and today is our third lesson. We are in Matthew chapter 2, which is when the Magi, or what are traditionally called the wise men, come to visit Jesus and give their gifts and their homage. So we'll begin with the study. The internet was not working again, as is pretty common in that part of the world. And so I was not able to record the session on Zoom. So I'm just repeating it here in our format so that we have a record of what we taught and they can use it as they wish. So here we are in Matthew chapter 2, the narrative of the Magi visiting Jesus, or the wise men. So remember the themes of Matthew that he's going to be continuing through his whole gospel. What Jesus comes to bring is true salvation for all who will come to him. All who will come to him. His mission and his gospel are for the whole world, and even Gentiles from distant lands acknowledged that he was a king. And that's really the point of this section of Matthew. Even Gentiles from distant lands acknowledge that he is a king. The very first spoken words by human beings in the Gospel of Matthew are here in this chapter, and they are these. Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have come to worship him. Matthew is showing us that even these Gentiles recognize that Jesus is a king and that he is worthy of worship. God always intended his gospel to be for the whole world. So let's talk about these wise men a little bit, these Magi. The very first characters we're introduced to in the Gospel of Matthew after the birth narrative are, of all things, Gentiles. And it's important to know that they come from the area of Babylon, where the Israelites had been deported to, where they spent their exile years. And then they returned from, they were brought to life from Babylon. So even this terrible suffering that they experienced in being conquered and taken away into exile, even this terrible suffering was part of God's way to prepare his people for the coming Messiah. Now, before we get too far, this story to me is an illustration of what we read in John 1:11 and 12. He came to his own people, but his own people rejected him. And in contrast to those who reject, anyone who will align with Jesus, those who are all in, he has given the honor and blessing and status of being his children in relationship with him. That's a paraphrase of John 1:11 and 12. And then in Matthew 3:9, in the next chapter that we'll be dealing with, Jesus said to the people, it's never good enough to say we have Abraham as our father. God can even raise up true followers for him, even in the most unlikely of places. And that's what we see happening here. The chapter after that, in Matthew 4:13 to 16, it says, leaving Nazareth, Jesus went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Because the people living in darkness have seen a great light, and on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. It was always God's intent to reach the Gentiles. It was always God's intent to reach the whole world, not just the Jews. His mission toward the Gentiles, right from the beginning of his ministry. Jesus has just been born, and Gentiles are on the scene, worshiping him as king. This story shows the beginning of that, and that door is open for anyone. Now, I'm talking to Hindu background believers. Now, Hinduism, by contrast, is not really for all humanity. Hindus generally don't have a missionary zeal. They don't try to convince other people to become Hindu. Actually, one must actually be born a Hindu to reach enlightenment. An American may hold exactly the same beliefs as your Hindu friend, but you will remain an outcast. There is only one path by which you can really attain entrance to the Hindu fold, and that you have to be reincarnated. If you live a good life, you have a good chance of being reincarnated as a Hindu. And after many transmigrations, your soul may at last be reborn as Hindu and into a Hindu family. And that's how you become a Hindu. Christianity is totally different than that. All right, back to our chapter in Matthew. This event, the coming of the Magi, certainly does not happen on the night that Jesus was born, the way every creche scene and most of our Christmas stories tell it. This happens anywhere from a month and a half to even up to 2 years later after Jesus is born. There's no specific timing that we're given, but we know it was at least a month and a half, and it was probably not more than 2 years. In Palestine, the ruler was Herod. Herod was a great builder, but he was a terrible person. He was mentally unstable, he was physically ill, and he was a violent personality. He was only marginally religious. He cares much more about his power than about people. And Herod in this story represents all that is wrong with Israel and all that is rejecting of the Messiah as Israel. And it was into this context that the Magi come. Now, the Magi themselves were political advisors. They were specialists in dreams and medicine, astrology, the sciences. They were like an ancient combination of priests and politicians. Some might call them witches or warlocks. They were certainly pagans. They were not followers of Yahweh. But we need to see that when God invites people to come to him, anyone may come. God gives an open invitation. In the last chapter, he invites prostitutes, women, peasants. In Luke 2, shepherds. And here in Matthew 2, even pagans. God invites everyone to come to him. And again, to repeat, we're going to see what John 1:11 and 12 says. That Jesus' own people reject him, but the Gentiles accept and honor him. Now, in Matthew 2, verse 2, let me get back to it. We have the first statement by humans in the book. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So, where's the new king? And we have come to worship. See, this is Matthew's theme. Jesus is the king, and Jesus deserves our worship. 2 chapters later, in Matthew 4, verses 8 to 10, we'll hear Jesus himself say that only God deserves worship. Well, Matthew is showing us here that Jesus receives worship. Now, back to the personality of Herod. Herod was a murderous king who would kill anyone who tried to take away his power. So, where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? Was a dangerous question to ask. Now, the Magi would have no way of knowing that Herod was the kind of king he was, or that this was the kind of country where a question like that can get you killed. But Herod had bribed and murdered and conspired his way into his office and position of power. But here is one who has been born the king. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? I'm sure Herod would see Jesus as a threat. Now, the Magi had seen something of significance in the night sky. The word the gospel uses is a star. But remember, they were astrologers who were continually looking for omens in the stars. We don't know exactly what they saw. Some think it was some kind of constellation. There's all kinds of guesses as to what it may have been. But whatever they saw, it obviously signified to them the birth of an important Jewish king, and it prompted them to travel. Now, since I'm talking to Hindus, stars in Hinduism are also seen as omens, but they are in a lot of cultures, a lot of ancient cultures, as well as even modern ones, look for omens in the stars. Stars were also used in navigation, and the Magi used the stars to lead them to Jerusalem. So, just making that connection. When Herod is asked, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" he was disturbed to hear this news, and so was the whole city of Jerusalem. And we understand why. We absolutely understand why. He's being told, there's a king, and it's not you. And it's no one in your family. So Herod was upset. And Herod killed people when he was upset, especially when his throne was threatened. He had killed his wives. He had killed his children. Herod calls his advisors to find out if there were prophecies about the birth of the Messiah, which tells us Herod's religious practice and religious knowledge was only marginal. This was an important prophecy. Herod should have known this if he were truly a God follower and a student of the Torah. But he calls his advisors to find out if there were prophecies about the birth of the Messiah, and there was. The Messiah would be born in Bethlehem and be a descendant of King David. He's depicted as leading his people like a shepherd. And remember, David was a shepherd. And God himself is often called a shepherd. And Bethlehem is the land of Judah, and it had been prophesied that a king would come from Judah. So we are seeing that Jesus fulfills the prophecies of ancient Israel. Jesus is going to be the David to come, the Messiah, and he's going to shepherd his people Israel because God shepherds his people Israel. Now, Bethlehem may be a small, insignificant town, and it even is to this day, but it will become one of the most important towns in the whole world, in all of history. Herod secretly finds out what time the star had appeared. He's obviously hatching a plan to figure out the child's age. And he sends the Magi on their way to find the child Jesus. The star reappears and leads them to Bethlehem. Now this one has to be some kind of miraculous star. Stars don't move southwestward. This is not just an omen in the sky, an omen in the star. This has to be some kind of miracle. Again, to connect to Hinduism. In Hinduism, sometimes stars have a divine nature, or they are the souls of people, of angels, or even of deities. Some stars enable scholars to determine the probable dates of historic events. Stars in Hinduism represent femininity and motherhood and angelic beauty. None of that is what's going on here. None of that. Christianity sees stars differently than Hindus do. Here, just in Genesis, stars are created things that God uses to accomplish his purposes. They are not angels, they are not powers or gods. Instead, stars are good gifts from God. They point to his glory, and here he is using them for his purposes. So the text tells us that the star led the Magi to Jesus. They give him gifts that were normal gifts you would give to a king. And these gifts do have symbolic meaning. I mean, you always gave a gift to the king. You brought a hostess gift when you visited Jesus. And Jesus then here, the important part is that Jesus is being portrayed as a king. Gold was a symbol of a king. Frankincense, interestingly, was a symbol of deity. So they are, but in those days, kings were often worshipped as deity. So they're getting gold, a symbol of a king, frankincense, the symbol of deity, and myrrh has different kinds of meanings to it. It can be a symbol of health. It can be a symbol of healing. It can also be a symbol of death. Those were the gifts, and those were very normal kind of things you would give to a king. Then God warned the Magi in a dream not to go back to Herod. Again, we see that God is personal, and we see him giving direct revelation. In Hinduism, there is no such thing as direct divine revelation like we see here. The Hindu gods are impersonal. They don't talk to people. Then it says God appeared to Joseph in a dream to warn the family that Herod is going to try to kill Jesus, and they needed to escape to Egypt. So Herod is sending soldiers to kill all the children in Bethlehem and the region around it that are 2 years old and younger. And we need to stop and think about this a little bit. It helps us to see what God is like and how he works. We have to have an accurate picture of who God is and how he works. God knows this murder is coming from Herod. By this time, the Magi have been gone for at least a couple of days. They returned by a different route. But God waits. And he wakes Joseph up in the middle of the night saying, "Get out now!" Now, he could have had them sneak away casually a few days ago. He could have instructed them in the middle of the day, "Pack up your stuff, it's time to move, I'm going to take you down to Egypt." But neither of those would probably have worked, despite that we may think those were good ideas or better ideas. If that had happened, Jesus might well have been hunted down. God knows what he's doing. But what we see him doing here is wait till the moment of desperation. Just as we saw before when Joseph was ready to divorce Mary, and God hadn't said anything to Joseph until that moment of desperation. And then the angel of the Lord came to Joseph and said, No, don't do this. What is in her is of the Holy Spirit. Here, God waits until a moment of desperation. And he comes to him at night with panic. You gotta get out. It says in Matthew 2:14, so he got up, took the child and his mother during the night. That night, Joseph packs the family and they run for their lives. Here we see in him, just making the observation, God waits until the last possible minute. But this is possibly the best way to protect Jesus. It's possible that Herod and his soldiers don't even know that Jesus was not one of those killed. Whereas if they had fled during the day, maybe it would have been a different picture. It's hard for us to play armchair quarterback or backseat driver to God. But maybe this is the way to protect Jesus. But we look at this style. He waits until the last possible minute of desperation before he acts. Now, could God just have protected Jesus right there? Sort of made it so the soldiers didn't see Jesus? Of course he did. He could. But instead he has them run for their lives in the middle of the night. But that's because God wanted Jesus to go to Egypt and come out. It's part of the plan and the symbolism and the prophecies. And so God doesn't want to just protect Jesus there. There is a wisdom that is going on, and God has them go down to Egypt. That's why he doesn't protect Jesus right there, even though that's something he could have done. Now then we also notice that God did not warn all the people in the town. Those children got killed. But we know that God is not generally in the business of interfering in the exercise of free will on earth. We also know that God doesn't stop all suffering or violence. Jesus was born into a violent world, as we all are. We'll come back to that in a little bit. The family takes Jesus to Egypt, which is God's plan. Again, we see a contrast where this pagan place, Egypt, they affords protection for Jesus and the family, whereas God's own people, the Jews of that time, are not in the business of protecting Jesus. Matter of fact, there was an attempt on his life. When Herod realized the Magi didn't come back to him, he sent soldiers to kill all the boys 2 years old and younger in the region of Bethlehem. It reminds us of the Pharaoh killing the Hebrew children in Exodus 1 and 2. So we notice here, just like in the days of Moses, so also in the days of Jesus, we see this parallel going on. And we notice also the theme of the shedding of innocent blood, which is one of the themes that we'll see throughout the book of Matthew. Since we're trying to understand what God is like and how he works, we notice that God does not protect these children and their families. He lets the course of events run uninterrupted. He doesn't appear to these parents in a vision. He doesn't intervene, and he doesn't protect them. God never promises to stop all suffering. When Herod died, a year or two later, it's hard to know the exact timing, but when Herod died, he was a very sickly man. An angel appeared to Joseph to let him know he and the family could return to Palestine. Again, looking at what God is like and how God works, God could have protected Jesus and the family even if they returned. Could he not? Couldn't a peasant family have flown under the radar and snuck over the border and hid in some obscure village? Couldn't God have done it that way? Yeah, God could have, but God in his wisdom makes the decisions he does. He has them stay away. The political danger is too great. It seems again that God generally lets events run their normal course without intervention and uses ordinary means whenever possible. Sometimes much to our consternation or anxiety, and yet we have to look at how God has revealed that he works. So then Joseph and Mary and Jesus returned to Palestine, and they went to live in a town called Nazareth up in the north in Galilee. So that was my presentation to the study group, and then I asked if they had any questions or comments. And their first question was, why didn't God save all those babies? Why just Jesus? My answer was, well, that might give the impression that God will never allow anyone to die, or anyone to be hurt, or anyone to suffer, or anyone to be killed. And can we rightfully expect that no one will ever die, that no one will ever suffer, that no one will ever be hurt? No, that's not rightful to expect. So a building and an earthquake falls on people, and they're all, we're okay. Well, science doesn't mean anything then. Gravity doesn't mean anything then. What if somebody's hiking along a trail and their foot slips and they fall over the cliff like that kid did in the Grand Canyon 2 weeks ago? What does he fall? He falls 200 feet and then picks himself up and dusts himself off and says, I'm fine. God never lets anybody get hurt. See, there's no such thing as science anymore. There's no such thing as cause and effect. There's no such thing as reality. That's not how the world works, and it's not how it's gonna work. And it can't possibly be right that no one will ever die. And so we are not to see God as the cruel monster, an immoral monster, because he did not prevent these deaths. There can be lots of other explanation, but that's enough for now. The second question they asked is December 25th the real birthday of Jesus? And my answer was, nobody knows the real birthday of Jesus. There are some evidences for December, late December. There are also some evidences that it was possibly in the spring or in the fall. Nobody really knows. By my study, I think it's most likely that he was born in late September or early October, but there's no way to really know. But there's no reason that we should say, oh yes, he definitely was born on December 25th. Nobody knows that. We only celebrate it in December, a date that was chosen for celebration, and there are various reasons why December 25th was chosen. Well, as you know, in other countries, like in Russia, they celebrate on a different day. They don't celebrate December 25th, and it doesn't matter. But we really don't know when Jesus was born. So that's the end of our study on Matthew chapter 2. We'll pick it up next time in the next section of Matthew.